Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us with another in our Talk With series. It's my pleasure to be able to talk with Elizabeth Rauscher, and she's going to discuss and show us some nice slides concerning mind dynamics in space and time, a very relevant subject to us, of course. Um, Elizabeth has this book, Mind Dynamics in Space and Time. She is at the forefront and has been for a very long time of a revolution in physics. The relationship between physics and consciousness has been a core focus of her work since the mid-1970s. Ph.D. and MS in astrophysics, nuclear physics and engineering, BS in physics and chemistry, the University of California at Berkeley. She's a former researcher with the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, Livermore Labs, and the Stanford Research Institute, and worked with NASA as well. She also has an interest in healing and I love this expression she uses, so-called psychic capabilities, because I believe, as she does, these capabilities are rather natural. Here's her full website where you can get much more on her and her bio, www.elizabethrauscher.net. So with that, let me bring up her. There we go. I'll make this full screen. And it's all yours, Elizabeth.
Hi, everyone. It's great to talk to you and communicate via our internet. Well, what I'm going to tell you is it's easier to do remote viewing than mess with this technology. But it's in its primitive state, evolving into possibly quantum computers. I think we better get our classical computers working first. Anyway, I have studied remote perception, the ability for people to access remote information across space and time for over 40 years. And I'll talk about some of my research with SRI, the Berkeley Research Group, which I set up, and the Fundamental Physics Group, which I set up. In '74, we started with 6 physicists, ended up with 40. And the issue was the conscious observer. Obviously, you have to have an observer to observe, to do experiments in physics or any science. And the role of the observer has been neglected. So, what does physics have to say about the nature of consciousness? And I remember I gave a talk on remote viewing at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, where I was on staff. And I was copying a Phys Rev article on the copy machine, and a grad student came up and started pounding on the copy machine and saying, "But this is denied by the main body of physics. Remote viewing can't exist. You can't access non-locally through consciousness alone." And I was afraid he'd break the copy machine before I got my article copied. And but I thought, I've got to reconcile consciousness with the main body of physics. Physics will not explain all aspects of consciousness. In fact, neither will neurophysiology, because we do have the non-local mind, the ability to transcend space and time and gain information blocked from ordinary channels of perception. Next.
Yep. There you go.
We did local and long-distance remote perception experiments with randomly chosen geographical locations for a person locked in the laboratory room with a monitor to try to perceive at specifically denoted times. And sometimes they kind of knew what, in the long distance, what state the person was in. or what country? Next. Next. There's very many organizations that have funded the research. The one I have is What is Reality, funded by the Consciousness Investigation Association. That's the other CIA. The methodologies of science is ascertained through observation and experiment, critically tested, systematized, and brought under general rules and principles, called theories or concepts or hypotheses. Mysticism is the belief that the most reliable source of knowledge is direct information or intuition. But both of these are intertwined in the scientific method. You cannot really move forward without the intuitive step of saying, how does all your data fit together? Next. What we are dealing with is the fact that we are using the methodology of science to explore the properties of consciousness, its nature, properties, and structure, which we experience every day, at every instant, every microsecond, and divide it up into more than that. Next. Experiment without inspiration or imagination, without recourse to experiment, can accomplish little, but for the effective progress, a happy blend of these powers is necessary. Ernest Rutherford, the father of nuclear physics. Next. That's me at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory at the Bevatron. I thought once I got to, I started out as a complete skeptic, but open-minded to the possibility of psi existing. And so I thought, well, after I decided it does, maybe we ought to just put out a proposal for experimental time on the accelerator and create a particle to our choice. Next.
There's a delay. Yeah, there you go.
Oh, it's a delay. Areas of scientific exploration. I worked with the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, which I was on a staff with. And there's a good book by David Kaiser on How the Hippies Say Physics about my fundamental physics group, which I started and chaired. Then I worked with the Stanford Research Institute with Russell Targ and Hal Potoff, and also Jack Houck of Los Angeles from McDonnell Douglas Aircraft. We actually conducted over 80 experiments, local, long distance, and precognitive, with better than 2 million to 1 against chance. Next. There's me, Ed May, Hal Potoff, and Russell Targ left to right at SRI. Next. Also work with Jeff Mishlove of his radio programming. Thinking Aloud is really good. And so that should be looked at. I think he's got a TV series too. Next. What you have for remote viewing is a subject or participant, which may not be a super psychic, but a secretary or an engineer free for lunchtime. That's the subject participant. A monitor is in the laboratory room to make sure there isn't any phone calls, cell phone calls, computer connections, or anything like that. In the laboratory room, you have pencil and paper and a recording method for recording the audio. Outbound experimenters use randomly chosen targets chosen by a random number generator, which can be an HP random number generator or a throw of a die. Usually there's 6 targets put in each experiment, and then they proceed to the experiment. They have a 30-minute drive time for local experiments, and then they go to their target and experience it for 30 minutes and not let their mind wander. Then the subject, after the recording, their material is sealed in envelopes in a safe. The subject is taken for feedback to the site. Judging can be done by computers or by humans. And I've used all kinds of judging techniques with multiple judges, and they're pretty similar. I even tried skeptic judges and non-skeptic judges, and they judge pretty much the same. Next. So the first target that came up in the remote viewing that I did was Jeff Mishloff was back at the lab. And what came up was the Oregon Overpass pedestrian walkway in Palo Alto. So I got out of the car and I thought, darn, it's an outside site and I forgot my sweater and it's cold. And Jeff back at the lab said Elizabeth Rauscher is cold and forgot her sweater. So I experienced a cyclone fence looking up against the sky. I had a clipboard and a tape recorder. And a policeman in shorts, an older guy, came up and started following me. And he asked me what I was doing. I said, I'm doing a remote viewing experiment. I was also trying to send an image of him back to the lab. And I'm doing a remote viewing experiment. And then I explained the protocol. And he said this is a 50-50 to his partner, who was in a patrol car down on the freeway. And I found out later 50-50 means nuts but harmless. Next.
Very funny.
So what he drew was there are 2 of us outbound. So the entrance does kind of look like the shape that he draws on the left. He said it looked like hangers on a clothes hangers, but with no clothes. Then he said he saw cross lines, which is exactly what the cyclone fence looked like in the lower right quadrant. And then he said there were yellow and pink flowers on a hillside near there, which was all true. Next. Then I began to get remote viewing targets. So I went to the City of Commerce of Palo Alto and asked them for remote viewing targets. And I said what I wanted was public places that you could go on, so you're not trespassing on private land. And then that there are unique in form and structure so they can be distinguished by a judging technique. So that sort of passed them by, but one of the targets I got was the Vellenbrosia Church. The subject was an engineer, Gary Langford, who was free for lunch. And what he said is, I see a yellow pole bolted at the bottom, which is true from the picture on the left. And what he drew was on the right. And then there was sprinklers. And me and the other outbound person were putting our hands in the sprinklers, and he noted that. He said they're both natural and man-made and swirling, which was true. Next. And then at the end, I put my arms around this pillar, and he said Elizabeth Rauscher is putting her arms around an extruded concrete pillar. So he even identified the type, and I went back to check that it was made of extruded concrete. Being an engineer, of course, he was being very precise. Next. So then we did a long-distance experiment with Gary Langford. He was outbound on travel in New Orleans. He worked at SRI, too. And what he said is, I was outbound with Hal Putoff, and our target was the underpass at El Camino Real and University Avenue in Palo Alto, near Stanford University. And it's like a long tunnel, which he drew in the upper left-hand corner, a dark tunnel where the traffic goes under. And then there were these windows, so we hung our heads out, and I was yelling across the country to New Orleans, "Gary Langford, we're at University Avenue in Palo Alto." And he said, "I hesitate to say where the target is. It could be any place in the Eastern Bay Area." And that was, he got the target right. Next. And then there was the one where I'm the monitor with Gary Langford. And Russell is outbound in New Orleans. Now, neither Gary Langford or I were sports fans. I guess we heard of the Superdome, but we were not, it wasn't top of our mind. It was the bottom. Whatever you could say about top and bottom of minds. He said, "I see a flying saucer as though it landed in the city. I see grass, but there's no sand trap, so it's not a golf course." And so I was thinking when he's talking, well, I don't think Russell's looking at a flying saucer landing in the middle of a city. But I just let him describe. I said, "Would you please draw and describe what you see?" So he made it 2 drawings in the bottom, and the 2 drawings at the top were obtained from the Superdome. Next.
Amazing.
He said it was a theater-like arena where people could observe events, and that's right. He said there were glass display cases in the entranceway. That was right. It was extremely accurate, amazing. Now, Russell couldn't go inside, but he said, "I can go inside. I'm not inhibited, unable to do that, because mine can go anywhere I want it to go." Next. So he even drew the freeway structure of where the Superdome is placed downtown. Quite accurately. Next. He still referred to it as a UFO. The target pool consisted of the Superdome, this French Quarter building. Next. Or this trolley car, or the Lake Pontchartrain Bridge, which goes out to Yin Yang. Next. Or this famous Jackson Square Church, or the sidewalk display called the Moonwalk. This is all in New Orleans. Next. So with the Berkeley Research Group, we worked with a person that was an oil explorer. And so he was using psychic phenomena to find live oil wells. And it was another underpass in Berkeley, a pedestrian overpass, and again a cyclone fence, but a very different structure. Next. He drew a freeway, and he drew the structure of going up the side of the hill, which was near there. And he said, for a joke, there's a 57 Pontiac. going on the freeway. And that's what you see from the overpass. Next. Then I did a series instead of east-west long distance, north-south long distance with Jack Houck of McDonnell Douglas, now called Douglas Aircraft. And one of the targets that came up was in the Life Science Building at Berkeley, where they're doing a whole bunch of rat studies of the effect of negative ion emitters on the rats. So I got permission to use the lab as one of the possible targets. So it was just rows and rows of cages with white rats in it. Next. This was Shumway Poole, and he was kind of inexperienced, but what he even drew a guy that was standing there next to me in a lab coat on the right, and he says, I hear a humming sound, which was the air conditioner to keep a constant temperature for the rats. And then he drew the cages very well. There's a learning curve. When people start out, they get better and better at the task. And no matter how many experiments you do, there seems to be no habituation like there is with Zener cards, which are boring to guess. Next. So last of this series is one by Hella Hammett, a friend of Russell Targ's. And so I'll show you the target pool for this, but the one that came up with Macy's department store. And Hella said, it's a big archway you could drive a carriage through. I can see the white mortar between the bricks. Now the experiment was a precognitive experiment. So she drew her and gave her mentation all before I went to the target or even chose the target. So her drawing's in the bottom, and she even got a park-like area to the left that I didn't notice when I was outbound with trees and a creek. So I said, okay, since you can tell my future a half hour in the future, how about telling me about the rest of my life? Well, she didn't do that. But it's very interesting about the issue of knowing the future. People have saved their life with recognitive perception and free will and determinism, because you need some determinism to determine the direction of free will. So there's wonderful philosophical issues that come into play. Next. The target pool was the Growth Center, the El Camino Real underpass, and targets were used there multiple times. And then the cement factory, and you can see her drawing is very different from any one of the other possible targets that were not chosen. So it'd be easy for a judge to judge the matching, which of course was judged in first place. Next. So one judging technique I used, there was the Pear Research Lab with Robert Johns, and they had a computer Apple program. I've used human judges, and then I used this 7-point evaluation where there's goes from excellent correspondence like the Superdome or Macy's department store, or good correspondence are getting with good analytical information that is not naming the place incorrectly, which sometimes is done. And then 4 is correspondent with several matchable elements, but not as good. Then 3 is a mixture of correct and incorrect elements. 2 is some correct elements. and then 1 is little correspondence, and 0 is no correspondence. At chance is 2.5 between 2 and 3, gives us our chance expectation. Next. Now this is a graph of all our data, including local remote viewing, long distance remote viewing, precognitive remote viewing. And the long line, the dark line, is for local experiments. And as you see, it got better and better. That's a learning curve that also included my learning in the various ways I participated in these experiments. The dashed line is the long distance. And I think it started up higher because there was more expectation and more care in doing the experiment, more concern about doing a good job. And then I did some group experiments, and I've done some more recent experiments, which I'll talk about next. I did a series of experiments with Dr. J.J. and Desiree Hurtak. He wrote The Keys of Enoch, which some of you may be familiar with. He helped co-author my book and to get it published, and they're wonderful people. Now, the subject in these experiments, which was done in 2012, was yours truly. The target was the University of Cairo, and there were 4 participants in that group. So I drew 4 people in the lower drawing of mine on the right. And then I drew this light standard, which was so unique. And I just was, that image was so strong. And I said there were people in Muslim clothing and Western wear, and got a lot of the elements correct between here and the University of Cairo. I knew they were somewhere in Egypt, but I wouldn't necessarily know where in Egypt. And then we hooked up the time to do the remote viewing. Next. This is JJ in the top, and it's under the Temple Mount in Israel. And I had no idea where he would be. I just knew he was in Israel and Jerusalem and other areas around Israel. And what I got was he was in, it's not so clear in the drawing on the right, but in the left part of my drawing in the middle is an arch, and I saw him underground inside of a building with white or light stone blocks, and there was a funny blue sign. Now the sign in the picture on the lower part to the right, that actually is blue, but it doesn't come out blue in the reproduction here. And then I heard Muslim call to prayer when he was in Egypt, and I heard chanting when he was in Israel. Next. Now this time I couldn't get any impression. I closed my eyes to relax, and then on the right in the middle I said there's a lion statue. Put your arrow a little to the right where you have it. That's it. And I said at the end it's a lion statue, and what this is called the second Sphinx in the Gaza Plateau. And that's where JJ and Desiree were at. In some cases, in some of these experiments, I got when they got stuck in traffic and were late to get to the target. And we did several different series, which is in the book. Next. So what I was saying is to reconcile the properties of consciousness with the main body of physics. So the first part of the book is on a whole bunch of the remote viewing experiments we did with details about the experiments. And gad, it even blows my mind. I mean, the accuracy is so amazing. It's about quieting your mind. And I will have to say, I had done many years of meditation, and that did change my life for the better. It helped with my physics work and to keep calm in the sight of the turmoil of life. I'll put it that way. So I won't read this in detail, but that's what it says, is to reconcile it. You're not going to explain everything about consciousness with physics, just as you don't explain everything about biology and chemistry with physics. But physics is a wonderful, good foundation. Next. I had planned that it would tell me everything about reality, but we're falling short on that one. Up in the upper left is what's called the Einstein-Minkowski four-space light cone. And it's about like when you're driving down the freeway, what's the next instant going to be like? Are you going to take an off-ramp? Are you going to keep on the freeway? Are you going to speed up, slow down? And all the possibilities become actualized as one future reality. And that's really how the light cone Minkowski space explains, how do I take from my present point in space-time to my future point in space-time at any instant. And so, of course, in quantum mechanics, this is presumably probabilistic, but we live in a apparently determined world. That is, there's only one of us at one point of space and time, and there aren't too many cases of bilocation or other kinds of phenomena. Next. So this is again the light cone. Now in the forward and backward light cone, every event is connected to every other event by less than the velocity of light. The edges of the cone represent the velocity of light. And in the elsewhere space, where the hashed lines are, that relates to velocities greater than the velocity of light. And I think psi is instantaneous. Since you can precognize, I think you can just set the interval between event and perception of event to be anything you want. Next. So actually, I had two books that got published, or actually more than two, where the image of the idea of what the solution is came in a dream. For my book on quantum gravity, which I published in '71, which isn't the complete story, but one approach to quantum gravity, I had solved part of Einstein's field equations in my sleep. And then I put in the numbers and apparently divided by zero. And like those old HP calculators that came up with the red error bar, the red error bar came up in my dream, and I woke up and wrote the equation down, which was fundamental to that book. Then in this dream, I said, okay, the problem with psi and being able to tell the future is there would be closed time-like loops. So like I could go forward and backward in time like a time machine and kill my mother before I was born. Doesn't work out. So I saw it as a spiral and a hyperdimensional space. An analogy would be a mountain with a road going around the side of the mountain, and two cars were coming towards each other, but they couldn't see that they were going to meet with another car and pass it. But from a hyperdimensional reality like a helicopter, you could predict the future that they would go by each other on the road. And so that's how I saw it. And from that, I constructed a complex dimensional space, which has been published in a number of physics papers and in 6 books. Next. So what you have to do is reconcile the main body of physics and psi, and there's what's called Poincare invariance. That is, if um, a Russian scientist does an experiment 2 years ago and I do one here, I get the same results if I do the same experiment. Analyticity is solving causality, that is, cause-effect relationship in complex space. Unitarity is the conservation of like energy probabilities. And so under Poincare invariance is Bell's theorem. And I won't explain a lot about Bell's theorem, but to say there's the Heisenberg uncertainty principle was one of the main philosophical issues in the last century. And this one, Bell's theorem, is one of the main things we studied in the fundamental physics group. And what it says, if I have 2 photons from a emitter source, that those photons are correlated non-locally. There's a non-locality fundamental in physics, as well as a non-locality of remote perception. And I call it remote perception because sounds and feelings and other things are perceived. And then analyticity has to do with causality and the ability to gain information from the future that is precognized and bring it into the present and to even act upon it. Unitarity or conservation, that's a more that is more difficult. It isn't a problem for remote viewing if you use information theory, but there are things like mind over matter, psychokinesis, psychic healing, and so forth, that would come into play. And that's in the book Mind Dynamics. Next. I won't go into this in detail, but this is the fundamental formulation of the real and imaginary parts of space and time. And in the bottom equation, the real dimensions of a separation in space are subtracted off by the imaginary components in time at the bottom. And then the real components of time are separated by the imaginary components of space. And I'll show you that in the next diagram. Next. If I have the present at the origin, where it's called event P1, if I go to event P2, that is like remote viewing between California and New York. But by access to P3, I make those 2 points look contiguous in the complex H space. So I really actually make non-locality look local and seeable from the person perceiving in California event P1 and seeing a target at P2 in New York. Next. So there's all kinds of non-local phenomena. Bell's inequality and its test with John Clauser and others, Young's double slit experiment, supercoherence or superconductivity, as well as plasma quote instabilities, which are collective coherent states, superfluidity and superconductivity, and I formulated these also in the non-local complex space in the course 5, remote perception. Next. So what's happened is science has tried to exclude the mind, and it's I call it the contour integral method, but there's a contour around what we call external reality that excludes our mind. But who is the one that perceives? Who is the one that analyzes the data? Who is the one that sets up the experiment? Who are the ones that build the huge accelerators like at CERN? And what is their vision? Well, it's all about their intention. And intention may even affect the results of experiments. So I draw the contour to include mind around there. That's right. Next. So we have been seeing the islands, the separateness, whereas there's a universal underlying interconnected all. And this has vast personal as well as philosophical implications, because we need to address a fuller nature of all. And what does non-locality say? We do affect. Thoughts are real. They do have real consequences. We do affect each other, and we might as well do that in positive methods in harmony. Next. There is no unnatural or supernatural phenomena, only very large gaps in our knowledge of what is natural. We should strive to fill in these gaps of ignorance. Ed Mitchell, Apollo 14 astronaut, who started the Noetics group in California, and he was an amazing guy. So that's my formal presentation at this point. And you might want to ask some questions or give some answers.
Elizabeth, that was great. Thank you very much. Yes, let's open the floor for questions. Most of you have mics that you can turn on or put something in the chat box if you don't have a mic. Don't be shy now. What was the book again?
Oh yeah, go to the next one because I do have a reference to the book.
Okay.
That's the one that's the physics book on non-locality on complex geometry, solving Einstein's, Maxwell's, Schrödinger, and the Dirac equation in complex H-space by World Scientific, published in 2011. And the next one, they're both on Amazon, is Mind Dynamics in Space and Time, a physicist's exploration of the nature and properties of consciousness, with J.J. and Desiree Hurtak. Mm-hmm. And that one's on Amazon. It was published, actually it says 2015 or 2016.
Okay. Let somebody else. Turns out I have lots of questions and comments. Lynn, yeah, you go ahead. Yeah, but I'd like everybody else to go first. Lynn?
Hi, Elizabeth. Thank you for your presentation today. These books, would they be really complex for someone who's not of a scientific kind of mind?
Orbiting the Moons of Pluto is a textbook, but Mind Dynamics in Space and Time has about half of it is general, so it's easy to understand if you don't have a physics background. It does have the physics theory for those who love equations, And it gives you, there's some introductions to those chapters that give you an idea of how this fits with the main body of science.
Okay. I have another question. I was watching some of the YouTubes that you were on, and came up in a discussion where you had been working on something with trying to teach blind people to see with some kind of geometry or something. It was just briefly mentioned, and it just piqued my curiosity.
Okay, what we had found is that certain specific electromagnetic frequencies in the extremely low frequency band and in the RF band can be combined in such a fashion to inject simple geometrical images into people's visual cortex when their eyes and ears and everything are blocked from direct perception. And it's 100% reliable, and it's not psychic phenomena. And we wanted to make the blind see, and we found we could do it with people that had several years of vision, but we tried some blind from birth, and they couldn't perceive what vision was. But unfortunately, to really do to get a prototype built is financially seems to be out of reach at the moment, but I would love to get that project going.
That's fascinating. Thank you. And one more question about, I think you mentioned also things about brainwave states and how, can you talk on that, how that helps remote viewing or psychic phenomena?
Obviously, being in a relaxed alpha state without distractions, like in the laboratory room, I wouldn't have pictures on the wall or a Persian rug on the floor, so that there isn't distractions from the remote perception. And getting into a relaxed state, closing your eyes, and just seeing what images come on what I call it like a TV screen. That's what it looks like to me.
Okay, thank you.
So that would be in the relaxed alpha state. If you're worried about the meter running out on your car parked, that probably would not be conducive to psi.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anybody else? Okay, let me jump in here, but all of you still have plenty of opportunity here. God, you touched on so many interesting things that overlap with what we're really doing in app. But one I found fascinating was you guys actually spent a full half hour doing what we call feedback. And how important do you think that phase is in the remote viewing and the precognition results you received that you had?
Well, there's some experiments done with, say, the target is a slide or an image on a computer,
Mm-hmm.
and the person died before they saw the image. So they didn't get feedback, and they still had good results. But feedback really helps the learning curve.
Well, yes, that was Pat Price. And
that's right, that was Pat Price, and there were several other cases too.
Okay.
One of the very good ones that Pat did at SRI, he was a police commissioner, was done, and then he died. Now, of course, maybe he got feedback on the other side.
No, I think that's exactly right, that the information is down someplace really deep, and he managed to go there. So you don't need what we call direct feedback, but is it your feeling that even for experienced people, it indeed would help because there's this non-local kind of connection?
Yes, I think it definitely helps.
Okay. Now, non-locality explains, I think, precognition. You can begin to get a sense of how that works. I love that graph where there were probable futures, but then you jumped immediately to the correct one using precognition. But how does that fit in with PK? The explanation for PK seems macro PK spoon bending, which Jack Houck was very much involved in. Say a few words on how you think that's all connected to this.
Well, we have to get into things. What I did is I looked at Shannon's information law, because I think there's no energy transmission from sender and receiver in remote perception. But in PK, I think there may be something to do with the Dirac vacuum, that there's available energy at the site. Now, I have noticed, like in Jack's work, we put heat sensors on some of the materials. So we bought aluminum and steel rods, so we weren't dependent on the spoon label. And the heat sensor showed what he called warm forming. And that is, there actually is sort of a heating. And I did a whole bunch of experiments with John Heston at Birkbeck College at the University of London with his subjects, and with Uri Geller. And what I noticed in doing electron micrographs of the samples that were mentally PK'd versus broken by a mechanical method is that they actually looked extremely different. And I had 4 major labs look at them. And what happened with the PK samples is the metal crystals, or the substance crystals, because I use nonmetals as well, were ropey and smooth and had sort of like holes in it where matter was apparently disappeared. Whereas the crystal structure in the broken samples, mechanically broken, showed jagged, the normal jagged control sample type look.
Wow, I love that. And let me say, Dirac vacuum, 0-point energy, that's what you're talking about here, quantum vacuum. I've always felt that that was the interface between, I call it a universe of collective consciousness, but whatever you want to call it, it's the interface between this information space and the physical world. And even when you do remote perception work, you are transferring energy to a certain extent because you're activating the nervous system.
Not only that, you're actually physically drawing something or saying something.
Exactly.
It involves movement of the body. Now, there's a paper by me, the Journal of Plasma Physics, Volume 2, page 517, 1968. It goes into detail on the vacuum structure in terms of Feynman graphical techniques.
I mean, this is just so fascinating because you're saying things with much more evidence than I really knew was out there. And let me connect this with one last thing. We know the connection with Bell's theorem, Young's double slit, all of that makes sense. But now you're connecting this, and again, through the 0-point energy field, with plasma instability, superfluidity, superconductivity. I've never heard.
I worked out the theory of these, and I have a lot of ideas of what the applications could be. Because you're going back from the psyche phenomena to what it says about physics and what can be understood in a larger contextual framework.
Wow. Okay.
It's a blast. It's fun.
It really is. In fact, we have a saying, consciousness is fundamental, where the fun part is all capital.
I love that.
Don't you love
for it. But I'll go for that.
Tell me a little bit more about the connection with, say, superfluidity. That again is all through the 0-point energy field?
Yes, what I look at is the MHD plasma formalism, which I modify, with the BCS model of superfluidity, where the Cooper pairs appear also to be non-locally bound, because electrons normally repel each other, but in superfluidity and superconductivity, they appear to be attracted to each other as like a phonon vibration in the material. And that paper is not published. It was a report for a contract that I had, but I'm thinking of doing some more with it.
Well, then the final connection here, which may be the most significant one for the long term, is consciousness and the connection to these phenomenon.
Yes, if you have a metastable system, it's much easier to PK than one that is very solid. But I was involved with a number of Jackhouse PK parties, and that's, I had started to analyze materials before I met him, but we got into doing electron micrographs, and there's a lot of clues in that, and some of it is just fabulously interesting, but a lot more needs to be done with it.
For sure. Okay, one last thought popped, and I've got to raise it. Cold fusion is now coming back in the press anyway. People are starting to work it again. What about the idea that things like that, which again are down in this quantum vacuum, ZPE field, whatever, where some people have been successful, some people haven't, we now may have a experimenter effect which is going on at this non-local kind of level. Does that make sense to
It's
you?
very interesting, because I noticed when I took freshman chemistry, and then later I was a TA for freshman chemistry and freshman physics. And I noticed some students could take the reactants, put them together, and the experiment worked. And I would take other students, make sure their beakers were clean, follow them through every step, and it still didn't work. It looked like an experimenter effect. That's where I got the idea of creating a new particle, like a Lee Wicks particle at the Bevatron, but I never got that done. But yeah, I did do some work with radioactive decay rates and human effects on that. And I think there is. Now, I don't know on the cold fusion, I have looked into that, even made a proposal on it. I think it's a very anomalous chemical reaction with the deuterium on the palladium, but I don't really know what it is, and I have looked into what they think is the theory, the guy that's working with Rossi, but without doing the experiment myself, and I figure it'd take me 2 years to do it, and if I didn't get any result, that means that I failed to do it, but it doesn't mean that the experiment is a failure, because other people seem to get positive results. But I don't think I want to spend 2 years doing that and then having someone, people say, I don't believe you. So I got to do something a little more believable, I think. But I don't know what to make of the cold fusion. The power company, they did, I think it was at SRI where they had an explosion. It killed one of the experimenters. So something is going on, but we don't know what yet.
Right. It's all, the payoff here. I just had an interesting image. In any energy creation plant, you have an operator, a primary operator who's watching everything. Now we're going to have the remote viewer be a primary operator for this.
Right. What he has to do is pass all our psychic research tests. If he flunks one, he can't be a cold fusion operator. No.
Right. Oh, this is fun.
Like anything, if you're going to operate a semi, you have to pass the test.
This is heavy stuff and not too far away from reality, I think. This is
very interesting. What if you have someone PKing your quantum computer?
Yeah, well, quantum computers, and they're moving ahead very quickly, raise all kinds of other issues. Because I said many times, and I get various reactions, that what we are is the most advanced quantum computers that we know?
Well, I think it's a very interesting question because like Henry Stapp and some of the others tried to reduce the consciousness to quantum events. But it's a macroscopic phenomenon as well as microscopic.
Absolutely.
And therefore, it's not completely reducible to quantum physics, I think.
No, I think consciousness is more fundamental, but building a quantum computer and the whole issue of can it be conscious in any sense? Because, we look very much like a quantum computer.
The Turing test, the thing is, that would be a trick. If you're talking to a computer, you ask it to do something psychic. If it can't, it's probably a computer.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, it's so interesting. Okay, we could go on for a very long time, but let somebody else have questions. Evelyn, it looks like you turned on your mic. Why don't you ask?
Yes, there's a woman named Starfire Tor, T-O-R, that has a theory about time shifts going on. Now, this is related to what people call the Mandela effect, but she says she discovered it long before they called it that. So she calls it a time shift event, and she claims that what's behind it is, I don't know exactly, a big energy in the universe, but the thing that's causing our local time shifts is action on the sun. When there's a huge like X flare and things like that, they don't cause the time shift, but they're time markers of that the time shift is going on. And we've had a lot lately that she's been documenting, and my thought is when we have these time shifts going on that she says are going on, it seems to be there's sometimes more displacement in the remote viewing experiments that I'm part of with Marty. And I'm just wondering if you remote view something 2 or 3 days ahead of the thing, and then there's a time shift happens in that interval, and then it turns out to be a different result. Is that a possibility that precog could be affected by time shifts?
I don't know what a time shift really is. If the universe blinked out for 1 billion years and then came back online, I couldn't measure the interval in between the 1 billion years that it blinked out. So I don't know how I would ever detect a time shift. I'll have to put that back as a question to you and Marty. I don't know.
Well, she's got some pretty technical stuff on there, Starfire Tor, T-O-R, and she's been on Whitley Strieber's and Coast to Coast and things before. I don't know about Coast to Coast, but she's been on several talk shows. I know I heard you on Midnight in the Desert, and I'm not sure if she's ever been on there, but she's got quite this theory going that we're experiencing these small time shift events.
What is it? But wait, could you say a little bit more about, what do you mean by a time shift? Time moves faster, slower, displaces?
No, that
I
there's
don't understand that
separate
either.
timelines, like people have talked about, that there's different timelines, and that in another
parallel universe theories.
Well, not exactly, but that our timeline actually gets moved, but sometimes because it gets moved, we will experience parts of both timelines for a short period, so that like we remember somebody having died and then they die again. That's the Mandela effect. And she's doing quite a bit of work on it, and to me it affects remote viewing if it is true. I don't know if what she says is true, but if it is, it's how the heck could you know which timeline that you're remote viewing if you're remote viewing something that hasn't happened yet?
I've heard of time shifts, but I haven't noticed any, and I'm skeptical about anything that I haven't researched myself, and I don't know what to say about it.
And let me say, I have a problem with it if it's related to multiple universes, because the whole idea of a universe is one. And
I agree
multiple
with you,
makes, I
Marty.
don't understand quite that.
No, I agree with you,
Okay.
Marty. If I
Yeah.
can't, in the Evergrande-Wheeler model, the idea is that at each instant that I show you where you go along the timeline, then if all those splitting ones make another universe, but if I can't measure them, they're not amenable to science or physics, so they're irrelevant to me.
That's right.
And if people are bouncing back and forth between them, I think probably people would lock them up, but that's just the conventional psychiatric, closed-minded people. I'll put it that way. But no, I don't know anything about time shifting.
Yeah.
Actually, let's see. I'm looking at the time because we have to go meet someone downtown.
Okay, let's maybe time for one more question.
A few more questions,
Okay,
and then
then we'll call it. Yeah, we usually
yeah,
end these things around
split the
1:30.
scene and swoop the group, as they said in the 30s. I was
Okay.
there though.
um, Anybody else have a question that they want to present? This is such an interesting area, and the connection with precognition for me is the key. And you and I obviously think very much the same, Elizabeth, because yes, there are things called, you can call them probable futures. Quantum mechanics has probable timelines, just like you drew. I love that sketch. You don't mind if I use it, do you?
No, just credit me with it,
I
and
will.
you can
I
use
will
it.
do that. And but the fact is, each now moment is real. That's what's happening. You know, there might
That's
have been a
what's
lot of,
happening
and
now.
that,
And then there's all kinds of. I could levitate. The ETs could take me away. Now those things are a lot less probable.
well, that's right. But
Finite probability.
but all I know is I have one now, and that's the one that happens on my life timeline. Even
That's
though,
right.
and that's what's down in this universe of collective consciousness in a special way, the ones that actually happen. Okay, let me see. I had
Dr.
written.
Rauscher, can I just ask a question about the book you cited in the very beginning by somebody named David? What book was that about the
Oh,
history at
David Kaiser.
Kai?
Kaiser.
Uh-huh.
And it's called How the Hippies Save Physics.
Yeah.
And it's about my fundamental physics group. It's published out of MIT, and I believe it's still on Amazon.
You did that way back when you were at Berkeley, right?
Yeah. I started that in '74, and we had our last lectures with David Bohm from London and Eugene Wigner in the late 1970s.
Does that make you a
And
psychic hippie?
well, that's the point, but I don't
Right.
wear hoop earrings and I don't wear a veil, or I don't, I probably don't consider myself a hippie, but that's all subjective anyway.
Just so wonderful. I've had such a good
I
time with this
wear
myself.
a t-shirt and jeans at home if I'm not wearing shorts.
Okay. Are there any other
It sounds like
questions?
it just sounds like you rubbed elbows with all the greats, and you're right up there with them.
Thank you so much. And actually, I did. I was fortunate to. Oh my God, Ingo Swann was fantastic. I mean, I've just been fortunate to, and even David Bohm and Eugene Wigner liked my theory a lot, and John Wheeler was really an encouraging person to me. And as a woman in science, I got a lot of discouragement. Probably I wouldn't have taken so much chances to go research psychic phenomena, which I wanted to do since I was a little kid, but I was always skeptical. And but then I had nothing to lose and everything to gain.
Well,
Well,
This,
thank you very much. I worked with a doctor who knew David Bohm, and this guy was a physician. He was a psychiatrist, and I'm forgetting his name now. I'm sorry because he did some publishing, but he had been friends with David Bohm, and he invented a form of meditation he called universal consciousness. And
Oh,
and and you were to like lay on your bed, and he said you can't think of two things at a time, that the mind can't conceive of that. So you were supposed to think about your mass of your body, and one other thing, like your breathing. And if you thought of if you concentrated on two things at one time, that you would go into a deep form of meditation that would,
that's probably
like,
why people use a mantra, because by repeating the mantra, you reduce the extraneous thoughts. But some of those extraneous thoughts are very interesting in meditation, and I think it's very important. I can't do yoga anymore, but I think some of that's very interesting and useful. And I met John Lilly and did the Lilly tank experience. That was very interesting.
Elizabeth, we're going to have you back. So remember all of this hookup stuff that we did, because I have a feeling there is so much more that you could talk to. I'd love to hear more about Bohm. Did Bohm believe in psychic phenomenon?
Well, he worked with Krishnamurti.
Hmm.
That Annie Besant of the Theosophical Society had brought Judaya Krishnamurti to the U.S., thinking he was basically the next Dalai Lama, in other words, next great psychic.
Hmm.
And he wrote a very interesting little book, which was really kind of nice and modest. But anyway, I met Krishnamurti through David Bohm, and they lectured together. And David Bohm, as well as uh, um, John Wheeler and others, really did what I did with the fundamental physics group, is to question the philosophical foundations of our knowledge.
Right.
Because to me, unless it has a personal thing to say to me, like what's the nature of the universe, um, it's it's not a relevant question. I mean, there's all kinds of work in nanotechnologies that's interesting, but it's not relevant, I think, to the search for truth and knowledge.
The deeper questions that I know you've spent your life on, and many of us are interested. Okay.
Yeah, and I thought next week I'll have the ultimate answer, but it's not happening.
Yeah, time has a way of revealing these. Elizabeth, again, I just really want to thank you for spending this time with us. It was just extremely valuable, and that's all I can say. Just thank you, and we will have you back. Okay?
Okay, I enjoyed it, and thank you very much for the opportunity.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, so I'll end this now, and you have a good of the rest of your day. I know you've got all kinds of other things planned. Take care now, and everybody keep precogging.
Right on.